Cecilia Calvo, and I am the Senior Advisor on Environmental Justice at the Jesuit Conference within our Office of Justice and Ecology. It's really good to be here with all of you today for our environmental policy briefing for the Teach-In. We are living in challenging times, and we feel this in a palpable way during the pandemic. We feel our common fragility. We can clearly hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. It's a time that calls for prophetic resilience and a new way forward, one that responds to Pope Francis's call in his encyclical Laudato Si for integral ecology, and for us to answer his invitation to all of us to care for creation and our common home. For we know we cannot separate care for one another from care for our earth, as they are intimately connected. As people of faith, we are resilient, and we are a people of hope. We can envision a new sustainable path forward, one that links economic prosperity with social inclusion and respect for creation. A Catholic response to environmental injustice and climate change places care for creation and care for poor and vulnerable people at the center. As the pandemic so starkly reveals, we are facing interlocking inequities related to economic, racial, climate, and environmental injustice. The coronavirus has already claimed over 200,000 American lives. Communities of color, and particularly Black, Indigenous, and Latino Americans are being disproportionately impacted by the virus. And studies have shown a direct link between air pollution and a higher death rate due to COVID-19. And yet 2020 has been a year of some of the most extreme air pollution rollbacks. Communities of color are more likely to live in neighborhoods with higher levels of pollution. This, along with other factors such as occupation and not being able to work from home, unequal access to healthcare and housing, along with underlying health conditions, explains data showing that Black, Indigenous, and Latino people are dying from COVID-19 at higher rates than white people in the United States. The pandemic is just a preview of the racial and ethnic disparities that will widen due to climate change. The historic overconsumption of resources by the United States has produced emissions that are intensifying climate change in areas across the globe, making it impossible for people to continue to support themselves due to issues such as prolonged drought and flooding. This is a factor also contributing to migration. As you see in this picture, Jorge is a Guatemalan maize farmer from the state Alta Verapaz, who knew if he didn't get out of Guatemala, his family might die, just like his crops did. Even as hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans have fled north toward the United States in recent years, in Jorge's region, Alta Verapaz, where there are precipitous mountains covered in coffee plantations, dense forest, and fertile valleys, the residents have largely stayed. Now, however, faced with drought, flood, bankruptcy, and starvation, they too have begun to leave. Here, farmers like Jorge face uncertainty about where their next meal will come from and how they will feed their families. They are no longer able to support themselves and maintain their livelihood. We must support climate policies that keep in mind the most vulnerable populations and frontline communities, like Jorge's community, that are threatened by climate change, both inside and outside our borders. During the pandemic, the US government has weakened countless environmental regulations that protect our clean air, water, and human health. These rollbacks are intended to prioritize the economy over human health and the environment. But this is, of course, a false choice. In addition to rollbacks of air pollution standards and efforts to weaken the Clean Water Act, the administration recently made changes to weaken a bedrock environmental policy, the National Environmental Policy Act. The changes made to this policy waive the review process for federal construction projects, such as pipelines. And this means that companies and federal agencies do not have to consider the combined environmental impacts before approving a new project. This NEPA proposal also limits the ability of the public to comment, raise concerns, or offer alternatives to these proposed federal projects. This could shut out voices from affected communities and lead to an increase in pollution, especially in economically disadvantaged communities, tribal communities, and communities of color. These are the same communities who are disproportionately exposed to toxic pollution and are most affected by the increasingly severe storms, wildfires, floods, and heat waves fueled by climate change. But we can choose a new way forward. At this historical moment, when we see so clearly our common fragility, the US is moving in the wrong direction. But we have the ability to change course and invest in a sustainable future. The US can lead the way by adopting policies to help us quickly move toward a sustainable and just transition away from fossil fuels and toward clean energy. As developed nations who have contributed most significantly to greenhouse gas emissions, how quickly we make this transition will affect millions of people and lives across the globe. This year at the Ignatian Family Teach-In, join us as people of faith as we urge elected officials to prioritize meaningful legislation that creates a just and immediate transition away from fossil fuels, centers frontline and vulnerable communities affected by environmental degradation and climate change, increases environmental oversight on new infrastructure projects, and addresses the connections between the issues of climate change, global health, racial injustice, and migration. Together, we can lift up our voices and protect our common home and one another.